I'm Ron Macbeth, and at present I'm Director of the Instructional Resources Center here at San Jose State University. It's my privilege today to be interviewing Dr. James Brown, Jim Brown, who has been a professor here at San Jose for a number of years and has recently become a professor of instructional technology in the Instructional Technology Department, having previously served at this university as Dean of Graduate Studies. Dr. Brown has had an extensive background in the media field, and in his early work, he was associated with what was then called visual education. Jim, how did you first get interested in the field?
Well, Ron, I think, like so many people, I didn't intend to be a teacher necessarily when I started out in getting a higher education, but remember that in those days it was the Depression, and one thing led to another, and pretty soon it became pretty obvious that one of the things that was very important was how do you pay the bills to get through school? And it turned out that an institution that trained teachers was the best prospect for me.
What year was that, Jim?
This is about 1932.
Mm-hmm.
And I had just before that graduated from high school and taken a course to become a radio telegrapher on board ship. And I had been that for some time, better than a year, and had made 2 trips around South America as a radio operator aboard ship, a merchant ship. And I became very interested in photography, and I became later a social studies teacher. Social science or geography was my major. And it just seemed a natural tie between teaching social studies and what we called in those days visual education. And I really got my whetted interest out of that experience as a radio operator.
What were the media then that you were using with visual education in the early 30s?
Well, the famous Keystone 600 set, for example, in social studies, which was a set of 600 3¼ by 4-inch black and white slides done by the Keystone Company in Meadville, Pennsylvania, was one of the tools that we used. We had mostly silent films when I started, 16 millimeter silent films. That seems like a long time ago, and it does. It's, 45 years ago or so.
About how long would one of those films run?
They ran, by the way, we had what we called reels in those days. It were a 30-minute film. It came in 3 reels, 3 400-foot reels, and they would run in silent speed for 45 minutes, 50 minutes.
Did they have captions?
They had captions for the most part, yes.
Did you usually run the film right through, or would you stop it
No,
frequently?
in those days, following the precepts of how you teach with a silent film, and I still think silent films have a great deal to offer in this regard. We would generally stop and start the film throughout and stop and discuss or put it on hold for a still picture on the screen, even though it was a motion picture, the day with a fire screen, so you could do that.
Well,
And teach from the pictures.
had you had then in your formal training to be a teacher, had you had courses in visual education?
I had 1 or 2 courses at the University of Washington, yes, under Dr. Phil Jacobson, and then of the engineering department, believe it or not, in so-called visual education, yes.
Was there a text that you used?
As I recall, no, there was no text. It was such a new field at that time that, to my knowledge, although Anna Verona Doris and some others did have textbooks earlier than that, at least we weren't using a text.
About when did the first texts come into the field?
Well, as I say, Anna Verona Doris, I know, had a text as early as 1924 called Visual Education. Frank Freeman had a book from the University of Chicago, had a book on visual education, and there were others before 1929, certainly. 1929 was a turning point, or 1930, and I remember I'm talking about 2 years after that.
Yes.
In that 16 millimeter sound films came into being with the ERPI, which was ERPI, Educational Research Products Incorporated or something. It was a branch of the Western Electric Company, and Western Electric had invented, I guess, the photocell or sound reproducing device for sound films in 16 millimeter size, at least. And because there were no sound films in existence, largely silent films, they went into the business of actually producing sound films. And about the time I went to the University of Chicago, a few years later, 1937, that company had been given to the University of Chicago, and William Benton, the former Senator William Benton, was then vice president of the University of Chicago. And this university became quite well known for its interest in 16-millimeter sound films, and the University of Chicago Press promoted them and sold them throughout the country.
Did IRPI then expand out into a broader company?
I think IRPI as a name was given up at that point
I
when
see.
it gave it to the University of Chicago.
And has there been some relationship with Encyclopedia Britannica then?
Well, later, you see,
At a
the
later time.
Encyclopedia Britannica was given to the University of Chicago.
I see.
And I think at that
Yes.
point they assumed the name Encyclopedia Britannica Films, but I'm not sure what the University of Chicago's connection with Encyclopedia
All right.
Britannica
Let
Films
me go
is.
back a little bit now. We're at instead of staying in the University of Chicago at the moment,
Yeah.
let me go back to how many years then were you teaching in schools in
Washington?
Washington?
Washington State, about 4 years in all.
And you got experience, which obviously whetted your appetite. Then you chose to do further studies at university.
Yes.
Did you choose to study further in the visual education
Yes.
field, or had it then become known as under a different title?
No, it had still that title. I think, although audiovisual education was coming to be used as another title too, and I think at about that time maybe we could say that audiovisual education was more common, getting to be more common.
How many different universities were offering courses which attracted you?
There were very few. I remember having written to Ohio State, where Edgar Dale was, and there were quite a number of courses there, and that would have been a good choice. I wrote to the University of Wisconsin, which at that time was offering courses. Pardon me, Dr. John Hanson, who later came to the State Department of Education in Washington, was teaching some courses at the University of Wisconsin. Stanford University had a course or two, and the University of Chicago didn't really have any courses that were identified per se as visual or audiovisual education.
What attracted you then to go to the University of Chicago if the others were offering courses?
There were a number of reasons, but one of them was that the University of Chicago did have the film program that I mentioned, the IRPI film program, and Hutchins and Adler and others had expressed an interest in this form of education as an innovation in education that would have some value and interest, and the University of Chicago's whole atmosphere was a very attractive one
I see.
to
Now,
me.
you're raising an interesting point here, because in some of the literature that I've read in the media field, Adler was never put up as a person having much of an interest in the audiovisual side. His interest was more on the reading.
Well, I could say that I don't think he expressed himself that strongly about it, but there were signs throughout the administration of the university that they were interested in this innovation.
When you chose then to go to the University of Chicago, who did you find there who was on the teaching staff that you became associated with?
Dr. Frank Freeman was probably the leading light, and he, of course, was noted with the Wood Freeman studies that were sponsored and paid for by the Eastman Kodak Company, and then as an evaluator, and Ben Wood from Columbia University, as an effort to identify what were the contributions to learning that could come from the continued and wise use, so-called, of 16-millimeter silent films. That was the number one person.
Yes, but had he done those studies prior to you going there?
He had done those in, I believe, 1929, actually.
Yes.
They were finished, I believe. So that was one. It was known that Dr. Edgar Dale would be there the following summer to teach, and he did come from Ohio State University. I took courses from him.
Who else did you take courses from?
Later, of course, from Dr. Stephen Corey, who went on to become dean at Teachers College, Columbia University. I took courses from Dr. William Scott Gray in reading and the related aspects of reading, which were of concern at that time.
Mm-hmm. Was Dr. Hoban in any way associated with the University of Chicago at that time?
No, he himself was not, but he had a great interest in, he was well known to Dr. Ralph Tyler, who, by the way, was another one I later took coursework from at the University of Chicago. No, Dr. Hoban was director of the Motion Picture Project of the American Council on Education. That was sponsored by the Rockefeller, or General Education Board, paid for Rockefeller funds. And it was Dr. Dale who recommended me for a Motion Picture Board, a Motion Picture Project fellowship,
Yes.
which I applied for and received, and worked under Charles Hoban for nearly a year on that project.
Now, had you completed some work at Chicago then?
I had completed my master's degree and had started on my doctoral work. I hadn't intended to stay on when I went back, but I did get a fellowship and was encouraged to stay on, so I did.
Were there many projects offered or coming along in those days which a keen graduate could get work in, do research work with?
I don't remember that there were very many. I know that there was one, the American Film Institute, I believe it was called, in New York City, that had done some research work. The Motion Picture Project was the most well-known of those projects, and it had been preceded by some other work that Dr. Edgar Dale and others had done, sort of laying the groundwork for this.
Mm-hmm.
But the Motion Picture Project was it was in a sense a kind of repeat of the Wood Freeman studies to see, in this case, what concentrated uses of 16 millimeter sound films as opposed to silent film could do in enriching the curriculum.
Had your studies at Chicago, had they been designed to encourage you in the research side rather than in the teaching, or what inspired you to want to get onto a research project at that time?
I think that I couldn't say that there was a conscious focusing on that end at the university, although Dr. Dale was certainly highly encouraging, and had it not been for him, I probably would never have thought of applying for the position, or the fellowship, that is. By the way, it was a very modest fellowship, and it was mostly the good that came from it was the experience of doing the actual research right there for a full year. By the way, Dr. Abe Vandermeer, who later became Dean of the School of Education at Pennsylvania State University, was another one of the fellowship receivers. Abe and I knew each other quite well in the state of Washington before we went back to the University of Chicago. He came there a little after I had. But
about how many people were working with you then on the project?
Well, there were 4 of us, as I recall, who had fellowships over a period of time, and Jim Finn, by the way, was one of those people who had a fellowship in that same project. He was there before me, I believe, by about a year, and perhaps I took the fellowship that he vacated. I don't know, I don't remember. Abe Vandermeer was one, and then there was a William Bowen from the state of Virginia, whose place I took in Virginia when I went on to do the work of helping to organize that program down there.
So what we've seen so far is there weren't very many schools offering advanced studies regarding visual education or audiovisual work, but there were some opportunities to not only advance your studies but also get into some research work.
Yes, I would agree.
This must have built up a good camaraderie among the people who were involved in this. This must have been, did you feel as you were doing it that you were on the cutting edge, that you were doing something very innovative?
Definitely. I've often said that further things that happened to me in my life professionally, I could trace definitely back to the experience of working with the Motion Picture Project. It was a very exciting thing to be a part of. And we had 8 or 9 schools and a university or 2 throughout the United States that we got data from, and Focus on Learning was the report of it. We got out an encyclopedia of films that was one of the first efforts to really critically evaluate 16 millimeter films, and that, although it hadn't been continued, has not been continued. I think the pattern was set there has had a good deal of influence on the field.
Mm-hmm. Now, any ideas as to why the American Council on Education sponsored such a project? Was there any, was this
I think that only by way of past experience that they had. Now you can say, well, how did they get into it to begin with? I don't know, but they did have 2 or 3 projects, smaller ones, much smaller, ahead of that, and Dr. Dale's was one of those.
These were the days when there wasn't very much money available for educational research,
That's true.
and certainly not very much for research in the audiovisual field.
But the American Council on Education had a reputation, and I think it still has, of conducting studies like this that they could get financing for, particularly from the General Education Board, which at that time was one of the most important sources of grant monies for this kind of thing going.
Did when you were on this project then, besides people who were in the who had been in teaching or anticipated going into teaching, were there other types of people in there as well? Were there people from the production field who had were interested in the project from a production point of view, or were you mainly educators?
Mainly educators. There were many contacts with government agencies and private educational agencies and public educational agencies for consulting work.
Mm-hmm.
People would be brought in. We had panels of people set up for evaluating films, for example, and they were drawn from all branches of government
So
and public
government
office.
was seeing quite a considerable possibility in the use of film within
Oh,
its
yes,
instructional programs.
definitely.
Who would be among the leaders in that area then at that time?
Well, I should have told you that Floyd Brooker, who later became the director of the war film project for the U.S. Office of Education, was the associate director of this project, worked under Charlie Hoban.
Along with Hoban.
Yes, and I think many of the things that Floyd Brooker learned there about film production, even although it was from a utilization point of view, stood him in good stead in his new assignment with the U.S. Office of Education. And as you know, he was probably the most influential person going with respect to or even the Armed Forces adoption of pressure for visualizing learning experiences for people in the Armed Forces.
Now, you mentioned a book came out of this, Focus on Learning.
Yes.
What date was that book published?
That probably would have been 1936, I would think. 46, not 36.
46.
Yes.
And Hoban was
He's
the
the
editor.
chief author. I think he was probably listed as the author,
Mhm.
the only author. It was a report of the entire project.
And the project itself then started. When did you start work? What year did you start work on the project?
It must have been 1942. No, 41,
41.
I believe.
Right. So in terms of years then, your interest in the field in 1932 as a school teacher, you taught for some years, and you went to University of Chicago around the mid-30s,
Yes.
and then you worked for some years.
The late 30s,
In
I
the late
should say.
30s.
Yes.
And you worked for some years then with the film project.
Motion picture
Motion
project.
picture project.
Right.
All right. Now,
1 year, really. It was just a 1-year fellowship.
that was just a one-year
Yes.
fellowship. What happened then? What happened after you?
Well, I went
completed
back to the University of Chicago and continued work on my doctorate, and with a fellowship again. And in about 6 months after that, I received an invitation to go to the Virginia State Department of Education as state supervisor of teaching materials.
All right. Now, was this one of the first positions of this nature?
It was an early one, yes. This was before the war, and you remember that Francis Noel, who gained a good deal of fame for what he did in California, was not appointed until after World War I. Now, there were other people in other state departments, B.A. Augenbaugh, for example, in Ohio, and J.C. Wardlaw. I guess he really, he was with the University Extension System, not the State Department of Education in Georgia. It was not, there were people in New York State. There were people, but it was not too common to have state-level State Department of Education personnel for this.
Now, what year again is this?
This is 1941.
1941. And
Right.
you've been invited to work in Virginia to
Right.
head up as state supervisor of teaching materials.
Right.
Now, that was a one-man office. To whom did you report?
I reported directly to the superintendent of instruction, state superintendent, at that time.
What authority did you have regarding budgets or personnel?
Well, we had an appropriation specially set aside for this, and I believe that I'm right in saying this was rather a small appropriation to begin with. Though before the war, is not what we had after the war. After the war, which we may talk about in a moment, was a good deal larger. But it was a relatively small appropriation, covered salary, and some small amount of money to buy films, primarily, And our plan was, at that time, before the war, our plan was to set up regional film libraries in state universities or state colleges to serve the schools on a loan basis with 16 millimeter films. That was primarily the beginning operation was that.
Right. Now, whose leadership was it your own, which led to the thought that these films might be placed in state colleges?
In state colleges. When I came there, the groundwork for the plan had been laid.
I see.
I think I probably got in on it about 5-6 months after a plan had been developed. And I implemented the plan for that before the war. And I would say that William Bowen, who I mentioned as having been a fellow also at the Motion Picture Project in Washington, was the actual person who had designed the original placement of the regional film libraries around the state.
What were some of the key objectives that they asked you when you were invited to take the position? What were some of the key things that they expected you to be able to do?
Well, it was pretty clear what they expected, because the State Department of Education was the whole staff of the State Department and much of the staff of the state's schools at all levels were then engaged in a very broad curriculum restudy. And it was under the direction of Dr. Paul Hanna from Stanford University. And you may remember the Virginia curriculum, which was a scope and sequence curriculum that created quite a stir in educational circles in those days. And I think they made it very clear, and I was happy to go along with it, that this was to be a from the grassroots up kind of program, not a from the top down program. Mm-hmm. And everything that we did was couched in those terms. It was an effort to see what could be done through a fairly simple beginning program to enrich instruction in the classrooms. Remembering
so the enrichment then would take place through the use of well-selected books, good films.
Well, our interest was unfortunately limited. It was primarily on what could films contribute to that. That was our
Your
first.
Your charge was
mainly films.
Yes.
However, in setting the plan to involve the 5 institutions within the state in helping to circulate these materials, it was with an understanding with those institutions that they would set up visual education centers or audiovisual centers in which these films that were to be purchased would be placed. And the films had 2 or 3 purposes, 3 purposes really. One was for any uses to which they could be put on the campus in the regular college classes. 2, especially making them available for teacher education classes in audiovisual education to help prepare teachers to go out and do a better job utilizing visual media. And thirdly, to loan those materials on just a regular booking basis.
Right, so these were
schools.
These were among the charges then, or the
Yeah.
expectations they had regarding you, that you
Yes.
would help develop film libraries in
Right.
certain places. You would help the use of those films within the
Yeah.
pre-service training of teachers to help them
Yes.
learn better about teaching and also learn how to use films themselves.
Right.
At this point, then, what follow-up opportunities were there being generated for teachers who would go out into the schools or for teachers who were already in the schools? Did you also have responsibility for creating some in-service training?
We did. Definitely. We had the charge to set up or to respond to requests for clinics and workshops. We actually put on a number of mobile caravan type things which involved participation by educators from various parts of the state, some imported from outside the state, some equipment manufacturers and media producers. And we would organize clinics in the various colleges and universities, generally the ones that were our regional centers. These would be attended by large groups of teachers and administrators.
With enthusiasm?
With enthusiasm in those
seeing
days.
how films could relate to the
Yes.
evolving
Yes.
curriculum?
There was a good deal, again, from the grassroots up experience. There was a lot of sharing of experiences, of success stories in a sense of people actually doing things that were exciting with these new media. Remember, these were very new media in those days, very new.
Did people see how the the films themselves may be changing the nature of education. Was this something that was
Well,
coming into their consciousness?
I think there were many, many people who were enthusiastically believing such things, yes. I can't say that it all worked out that way, but I do think that it made a difference in their attitude toward education. There were many people who became quite convinced that this was a way of making education a good deal more effective than it had been.
What were some of the things that sustained their enthusiasm then? Was it because of their impact on the students, or their ability to communicate with
Well,
ideas that have been hard to get across before?
I think that both of those things played a good deal of a role in this. And remembering, too, that adding sound to films had added a new dimension to what the film could do. There were some people who were, I suppose we have some of the same kinds of people today who think that these things can do it all and that they could almost replace teachers. There was that kind of enthusiasm, misplaced in many ways. But I think that the thing about it that attracted so many people was the sheer novelty of having a tool such as this, an exciting prospect for what it could bring to the classroom. Bringing the world to the classroom was more than a slogan. It was an intention that people had in their minds when they became engaged in these kinds of activities, I think.
Right. Now, bringing the world to the classroom was one factor, but the world itself was changing pretty rapidly. America had entered World War II at this stage. What was happening?
It hadn't yet entered it when we were there the first time. Yes, it had. It had just entered it. You're right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're right.
Let me then try and get in some perspective from the people that you worked with and the enthusiasts among teachers. There must have been emerging a group who started to see themselves something as specialists within this field.
Professionals in the field,
Professionals in
yes.
the field.
Yes, the leadership emerged. And again, I think the Virginia approach to it helped this because of the grassroots focus of it. And even in the matters of developing policies and principles and procedures that would be followed in administering these programs, there were a number of people who got recurring responsibilities, and they have, in some cases, gone on to do more in this field.
What happened to your own career at this time, and what was your next step?
Well, my next step was to go into the service. I accepted a commission in the Navy and went into Francis Noel's utilization branch of the Bureau of Naval Personnel, and was given, as were so many people at that time, a variety of experiences, which I think we turned to good stead after the war, used the experience to build on and do other things.
Were some of the people with whom you had worked in Virginia and contacted through through Chicago, were they also in this enterprise with Francis Noel?
There were a few, but I must admit that my experience up to that point had been limited to about a year and a half in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the people I later came in contact with in the Navy, I had not known. I had known Francis Noel through his connection with the Motion Picture Project. He, too, was engaged in that. I knew Abe Vandermeer, as I say, and he was in the program. But there were a few. I knew Jim Finn. I knew of him. I don't believe I had ever met him up till that time, but I knew
Finn went
into the Army, yes.
With Hoban.
With Hoban. And Hoban, of course, no, not with Hoban, did he?
Hoban was his senior officer
Well, I didn't
at
know
one
that.
stage. He may not have gone in immediately.
He ended up at the Staff College in Leavenworth, Kansas, I know.
Yes.
And I didn't know the two were actually in the same program.
Well, I believe they were, but let's come back then to the Navy and your entry into these activities.
Mm-hmm.
Were you in charge there of production or training people or utilization of materials or storage? What aspect of the...
I really was in charge of both the utilization and distribution aspects of three particular programs, different programs throughout the almost 4 years that I was in the service. First was I was sent to the 12th Naval District Headquarters in San Francisco and asked to organize an educational media program for the 12th Naval District. And this meant really from the ground up. I was given one office, empty office, and we started from there. Our first shipment of films were 35 millimeter nitrate-based films a fire hazard.
Ready to explode.
Ready to explode any moment, and they were wished on us by the Bureau of Aeronautics of the U.S. Navy, I'm sure. Well, needless to say, we dumped them, but we eventually got a going concern that was responsible for acquiring and distributing media software, films, film strips, training aids of various kinds, and of improving the utilization of those media by whatever means possible within the 12th Naval District, which extended from San Francisco to Colorado and south halfway to Los Angeles and so
now,
forth.
was the 12th Naval District principally concerned with training?
Yes.
Recruits?
Recruits and in-service personnel.
I see.
You see, we serviced all the ships that came into the San Francisco harbor, and by service I mean we would replace films, add new films. The program, the Navy program, was really an exciting one in that regard, in as much as when there was an emphasis in training on some aspect of naval warfare or naval operations, films seemed always, and audiovisual materials seemed always to play an important role in that. And toward the end of the war, it became an in-service thing more than the training of recruits in a way, and the development of new equipment for use on board ship required a concomitant training program, which the films fulfilled a role in.
Did you, at this time, did you have any input into the types of films that were needed? Did you have any influence at all regarding what the subject of different films should be?
We were asked to filter back suggestions, yes, and we had our own newsletter and other means of communicating with the people who were our users. We had a whole retinue of users all over each district. They were always invited to feedback, and I think that there were many channels for suggestions about what ought to be produced.
Yes.
Didn't necessarily come always from the visual side of things. They came from the actual operational side.
Did the films come in a standard length, or were they
No.
of various lengths?
No, they came in various lengths, up to 60 minutes or even more. Most of them were, typically they were, I think, in the 800-foot can range. They're up from 15 to 20 minutes.
What influenced the length of films in those days?
Well, I think it would be fair to say that what it required to tell the story adequately, but there was also, I'm sure, there was some attention given to what an optimal film length would be, at least what is the maximum it can be and still retain attention.
Besides attention being given to such factors, was there a research program associated either with the 12th District or with the Navy in general?
Well, each of us was encouraged to conduct whatever research we were capable of conducting and still do our job of managing the day-to-day operations. And there was, in the Bureau of Naval Personnel in Washington, there were personnel assigned to carry out some kinds of investigations. Lester Beck was, who later went to the University of Oregon and gained a good deal of fame in the field, was one of the people in working with Francis Noel on this aspect. We did our own research, we could call it that, when I was sent to the United Kingdom and to set up a similar training aids program with the amphibious forces over there. We did one more on the extent of utilization and what kinds of materials were getting the most applications in the training programs, and filtered this information back to BUPERS and the Bureau of Aeronautics, hoping it would influence their production policy.
When you were in England on this type of research, was there any evidence that the British were also carrying out research?
Oh, yes. British were, I think, in many ways, were doing a good deal more than we were of that type of thing. Mm-hmm. They were very well organized in their audiovisual services for the armed forces.
Was this the general term that was used with the media in the armed forces, audiovisual services?
Audiovisual services. I remember that specifically because the admiral to whom I reported to announced that we had arrived with 8 officers and 50 enlisted men. Thought audiovisual education was something like visual signaling.
Yeah.
And it took a little time to educate him as to what we were really there for.
Now, your work with the military would be, I assume, focused principally on the tasks ahead of you, but on a day-to-day basis, were there opportunities to meet with other people in the audiovisual field who were working within either universities or public school systems or the state
You mean while in the service?
whilst you were in the service?
Yes. The universities then, as now, were playing an important role in the whole armed forces program. And many of the universities that we had special relations with had V-12, V-8 programs for the training of officers and enlisted men. And so I remember the University of California, which was one of the early participants in this work, with their big film library for extension purposes. People like that, yes, we did associate with them. We did get cooperation from them.
Had you formed yourselves into also an association of professionals at this time? Was there a...
There was one. It was the Department of Visual Instruction, DVI.
Yes.
It became DAVI sometime, it seems to me, after the war.
Mhm.
I remember my first DAVI convention, however, was 1946. I had never attended one before, and they were very small, and even that one was very small.
Yes.
We met with the American Association of Superintendents, American Association of School Administrators, AASA, in Atlantic City, and I remember that our whole convention was held in one room that held fewer than 100 people.
Yes.
We had no special exhibits or anything of the sort that we have today. Contrast that with the one at Miami Beach or elsewhere, where there were, let's say, 7,000 to 8,000 or 9,000 people and some 500 exhibitors and so forth. Things have changed in that regard.
Were there a lot of ex-Navy and Army and Air Force audiovisual specialists in the first DAVI meetings?
Oh, yes. Well, the first DAVI, you mean after the war?
After the war.
Yes, there were. And I remember there were also quite a number of people who had worked with Floyd Brooker. And Floyd Brooker himself was there with the whole U.S. Office of Education program. There were a lot of people who were, in a sense, alumni of that activity, and many of them were there. Yes, I think it was the first opportunity to really demonstrate what a professional group could do and could be. It was small, but it was a dedicated group of people who felt that the world was ahead of them yet in this regard.
Now, up until this time, then your background had been both in studies and with experience in schools and in the military. Now, at this stage of your career, what degrees had you completed?
I had only completed the master's degree at the University of Chicago, and I had started toward the doctorate. So I had kept this in my mind that I did want to get back to it.
Mm-hmm.
So after a year getting back now to Virginia in about 1946 after the war,
Yes.
I finally decided that was enough and that it would be a good time to go back to finish my degree. So I went back to Chicago for that.
What, after having, summed up your Navy experience, what benefit do you think the Navy experience was to you principally?
Well, I had experience in organizing training aids programs from the ground up in two places, one at San Francisco, 12th Naval District, one overseas in England for the amphibious forces. And I think specifically I turned that to good stead in my assignment back in Virginia after World War II. After World War II, if I would like to turn to that for a minute here. I was asked to come back again and take up on an appropriation that had been made especially in the cause of audiovisual education for the Virginia schools. Colgate Darden was then the governor, and he, I believe it was as a General Motors car dealer in Norfolk, Virginia, had become quite convinced that audiovisual education had a great deal to offer education. He had come to that by the way in which his mechanics had been trained by some General Motors sound film strips and other visual products for training them in performing specific operations on automobiles and so forth. In any event, he was influential in seeing that a special appropriation was made. It was something over $1 million. And I was asked to administer the actual expenditure of that money in allocating it to 110 school districts within the state, and getting a matching program going so that every time a local district raised $1 for this purpose, the state would match it with $2, and we would help them develop their own individual district media programs. Audiovisual education, really, they were a program. Although there was a good deal more to it. It was a materials program this time. They could buy films, film strips, maps, projectors, even templates, puppetry devices, globes, anything that was of an instructional material nature that was on an approved list which had been developed by the State Department. This matching money and their money could be used to buy. And this was a completely different kind of development from the one before the war, where the emphasis was upon getting the regional centers started. And so during this time, we did put more money into the regional centers, but we set up a large number of independent school district media centers that were serving schools on quite a close range basis. And the emphasis was upon trying to get the media and the services, and trained personnel, by the way, as close as possible to the eventual user, and not depending this at that stage on someone in a regional library sending materials out. You'll have to remember that Virginia, in those days, highly rural, still is, but even after World War II, there were large numbers of schools that were without electricity. We had even contemplated the possibility of using audiovisual projection devices that were gasoline lantern powered and others. But the governor put the pressure on the Virginia Power Company to extend power services to school districts, schools, individual schools. And all over the state, they were able to report rather dramatic gains in the numbers of schools that had added electricity. And that helped the program immensely. We bought a good deal of surplus material from the armed forces after the war. I remember at this time Henry Durr, who later took my position there in Virginia when I left, and who was director of audiovisual services here in the Santa Clara County, as well as over in the state of Hawaii.
That's right.
Henry Durr went to Baltimore to a surplus sale and was influential in our being able to buy 2 truckloads opaque projectors, enough to that we could get 1 or 2 opaque projectors into every school district in the state of Virginia. Well, that seems like a small thing, but it was quite dramatic, you know, to see that now they were able to use an opaque projector, whereas before they had no access to such at all.
And these were surplus from the military program?
Yes, I think we got them for $10 a piece. Mm-hmm. It was a real boon to our program.
How long did you stay?
I was there a little over about 16 months after the war,
right,
during the time that we spent that money, yes.
You've had a lot of experience helping to build programs from the grassroots, but it didn't stop there in Virginia. You've also, I believe, had some experience in Europe again.
Yes.
And with the Marshall Plan. When did that occur?
Well, that occurred sometime later while I was at the University of Washington.
Yes.
Let me just say that I went to Paris for a year on a leave of absence from the University of Washington, and it was on what's now AID, but the Marshall Plan. And it was part of a program that had as its focus the bringing to Europe of films, primarily films, 16mm sound films, produced in this country that carried a message of efficiency in production of anything, almost any product or any personnel service or anything that where efficiency could be looked upon as the necessary ingredient. If there were a film that helped with that, we were likely to have gotten it over there in its English version. And then we worked with 13 countries in Europe, each of which had its own film library set up, and that was my job primarily, to help them set up film libraries. If the country concerned, one of the 13 countries, wanted that particular film that we had brought over, it would be dubbed in their language, whatever the language was, and a training guide would be prepared to go with it, and they would get copies of it to put into their distribution system. It would then be used with industrial groups, and ostensibly in an effort to improve the efficiency of production. That was our goal, that was our God, in a sense, was efficiency. And in those days, it was thought that all we needed to do was to improve the gross national product of the country, and life would improve thereby. Now, that was only partially true, but there were dramatic growths in efficiency within every one of the European countries. Now, how much of it could be attributed to the film program, I don't know. But I can say this, that program still exists under the OEEC, Organization for European Economic Commission.
Now, before we go on, let's just take a pause here for a moment and get a chance to have a look at the next phase of this discussion. Jim, we have discussed reasonably well the work that you've done in Virginia State at the state level, and we've also talked about your work with audiovisual in the Navy and representing the Navy in Britain. What I'd like to get into now is your work at universities. Which universities have you worked at in your career?
My first assignment was at Syracuse University after getting my doctorate in 1947. And I went from there to the University of Washington, where I was director of the Film Center, University Film Center. And while there, helped with the state library office in setting up what we thought of as one of the early library film networks in the state. We had a cooperative arrangement with a variety of libraries throughout the state who took our extension films and had them used in their own communities on a free loan basis. And it was quite a startling set of statistics that we gathered as a result of that one. Then I came to San Jose State in 1953.
Right. Well, let's go back to Syracuse. What were your major responsibilities at Syracuse?
I had two responsibilities. I always seemed to have the campus service program for utilization on the campus, and that was started from scratch for that. It had never been offered on the campus before, and we had a very modest program, I'll have to admit. But I was also in charge of setting up the original curriculum for master's degree work in instructional technology, is what it's called now, but it was called audiovisual education then. So I designed a series of courses. I think we had the traditional 3 or 4 courses, one on the basic course, a course on administration, and an omnibus course on production, which, when put together with a variety of courses throughout the rest of the School of Education, produced a master's degree in the field. I remember we had one boon for that was that we received, I think, a $1,500 grant from Encyclopedia Britannica Films to be used to award scholarships for the summer session. We were able, by that means of offering as little as $25 to $50 or something in that range, to get a group of about 25 top quality people who came to Syracuse and started their master's degree work at that time. And many of those people are still influential in the field and working in various government agencies and universities.
Can you drop some of the names?
Mike Guido, for example, with AID in Washington. Neil Kroom at Rochester Institute of Technology. There were many others. I don't recall too many names at the moment.
Then, after Syracuse, then at the University of Washington, what were your responsibilities there?
At the University of Washington, I was director of the University Film Center, and I did teach one course in the library school, a basic course for librarians in the audiovisual field. We started again. It always seemed I was starting from scratch to build a new service, and this was a campus service and a combination of campus and off-campus loan service. We had a grant of about $100,000 to buy films to start the service, and we began to offer loan materials to the schools in the area, but our real emphasis was upon uses of such materials by adult groups. And our buying policy favored the films that would appeal to adults. And we served largely throughout the state of Washington, but we did serve some outside the state of Washington. And we served the campus with a regular comprehensive media program such as you offer here at San Jose State.
How many years were you at the University of Washington?
All in all, 5 years there.
Which years were they?
They must have been 5 preceding 1953. I came here in 1953.
What led you to come to San Jose?
Well, I think that I had a rather limited opportunity for teaching, which I felt I really wanted to do at the University of Washington. It was just one of those situations in which it was not going to be possible to have a regular academic appointment, probably, for some time at least. And San Jose State presented itself as an opportunity, and I have been eternally grateful that I came to San Jose, and ever since I have felt that way.
What was the title of the job you came to here?
I was Associate Professor of Education when I came.
And what departments?
It really was education in those days. We didn't have departments. It was such a small, relatively small, although this was one of the largest of the California state colleges at that time. Our education program was not all that large either. However, I taught mainly, the first quarter or so, I taught mainly audiovisual courses, but I did teach in secondary education. I supervised student teachers. I think I got a breadth of experience in various kinds of courses taught at that time. But it was heavily in the audiovisual field with Dick Lewis. Dick Lewis was in charge of the media program at that time. The one assignment I was given early in the game was to develop a cooperative program with the Department of Librarianship, which would make it possible for people who wished to specialize in school librarianship with a media emphasis could do it, or those in the media side who wanted to have enough librarianship to perform well in that job in the field could do it. And we did develop that, and it's still that way.
That was early, as I understand
54.
it, early in the sort of moves to get a cooperative effort between
That was my understanding.
audiovisual and library people.
Right. It was not very common to do that. Fred Harkerode was the dean of the college at that time, and he was particularly interested in this being done, and that is why it was done, among other things.
In the how many people were there in when it was decided to make a Department of Instructional Technology or a Department of Audiovisual Education? What was the first specialization here at San Jose? When was it decided to make a single department?
It seems to me it was long after that. It was not until the 60s, somewhere about the time of the Educational Media Specialist Institutes, which we had one of here on our campus for years, that during that time we began to get enough enrollment in these courses and enough professional attention given to it out in the schools that it became quite obvious that we should have a departmental specialty in this, and it was given that status. When and how, I'm not actually sure, but I think it was about 1965.
Well, from the mid-50s to the mid-60s, there was a great growth in the audiovisual field and at instructional television, use of teaching machines and programmed instruction, the use of language labs. These became forces within the field.
Yes.
And while you were here at San Jose then, you were obviously not only involved with that, but also in terms of integrating with the librarianship department.
Although, again, I'll have to say that during that period between, say, 1955 and the time that I went back to full-time teaching, 1972, that I was engaged in administration more and more, and finally and totally involved in administering the graduate program of the university as Dean of Graduate Studies for the university. So I had less direct contact with it. But during that time, I was given a contract with the U.S. Office of Education to evaluate these 100 and some educational media specialist institutes under Title VII of the NDEA, and also some 60 or so media institutes for librarians, school librarians across the country. And that took a 3-year stint there to complete that. And I found that a very, very absorbing activity, and one which gave me more insight than I had a right to expect on how the program, how the field was developing and which way it seemed to be going. those were exciting days, post-Sputnik.
Yes. Can you share with us some of the observations that you made at that time?
Well, we made an effort to find out in our final reports this, what the media institutes were like, who came to them, what it did to the people who came to them, and what appeared to be a good institute program. We were trying to answer all those questions. And I think we made a fair stab at answering them. And we did follow-up studies, among other things, by mail and in person. We had a number of field interviews that we followed up on people with in an effort to find out particularly whether they believed and whether they could have evidence to show that they did in fact profit, either financially or professionally or in some other way, from attendance at one of the institutes. I think we came out, I belong to the gee whiz school of thought maybe on such things, but I believe we came out with a feeling that the institutes were the single most valuable professional activity that these people had ever engaged in. And while they were not all peaches and cream, in balance, they were an influential force in the development of their professional skills, and their professional life had been influenced considerably by the time they spent in those institutes. There was a camaraderie, for one thing. There was a high selectivity of the people who were allowed to come and given grants to come. There was a distinct honor attached to being selected for one of these institutes. The faculty had a teaching load for an institute that would be unheard of in ordinary day-to-day teaching in a university. The resources that were at the command of the workshop director and the staff and the students, even down to the matter of buying materials and supplies for those institute activities, was just remarkable. And all in all, I think that the institutes could be shown, and there have been some follow-up studies, one done by Des Wedberg at the University of Maryland, using our same mailing address, by the way, which I had saved, would show that the media specialist institutes were an influential force in professionalizing our field. Good. I do believe it.
Now, in addition then to your involvement with the institutes and professionalizing the field in that way, you also have become very active in the writing side of the field. What year would you say was when you started to give more thought to putting down some ideas on paper and helping to organize those, and when did you first start seriously?
Well, I remember distinctly about the last year that I was at the University of Washington. It was while I was overseas on the Marshall Plan from the University of Washington that I became convinced I'd like to try to write a book in the field, a basic book in the field, and started to do that. And little did I know that Dick Lewis was thinking of the same thing. And little did I also know that Fred Harkerode was thinking of the same thing. And when we were finally approached by McGraw-Hill to do just that, little did they know that we were all three at the same institution. And so the coincidence was that the three of us were all at San Jose State when they thought that Fred Harkerode was still at San Diego State and that Jim Brown was at the University of Washington and Dick Lewis was at San Jose State. So we formed a team to do this, and I'm happy to report that 20 years later we're still great friends. We do talk to each other, we work together closely and have for 20 years. And it's been a most enjoyable and stimulating thing. But it started, I would say, about 1952 in there somewhere.
There have been several texts have come out since you contributed, but at that time, as I recall, there were only one or two other major texts in the field.
One was Edgar Dale's, which we really thought, was the Bible, and to many people it is still the Bible. We were brash to think that we could sell a textbook to the field, another one, but we were also brave in that regard, and we did, and it has, and we were happy about it, and I know that the others who have used it feel that way.
But that isn't the only publication, Jim, that you have either written or assisted in writing or had people assist you. Some of the other publications have had...
Well, I've been interested in college teaching, and so with Jim Thornton, who was a professor here for years and later became president of Honolulu Community College, he and I did 2 editions of a book called College Teaching. We did one on going to college in California, which we thought was going to be the world's bestseller, and it turned out not to be, but that's the way it goes. He and I also did 2 studies, one both on new media in higher education or in college teaching. And while I was at AECT just 2 weeks ago, I inquired about new media in college teaching, whether they still get requests for it. It came out in 1968, and believe it or not, since January of this year, and this is only 6 months later, they'd sold some 350 or 400 copies of it, which says to me, well, it's interesting that a book as old as that is still selling.
Yes.
And that made it always a pleasure to know that they were.
Some of the you've also contributed in the field of administering media programs.
Yes, with Ken Norberg, and then later with Sarah Strigley, a book on administering educational media. Last year or 2 years ago, it's hard to remember, when I was on sabbatical leave, I did my sabbatical study was on new media in public libraries, and that's been published since then by Gaylord Brothers under that title, New Media in Public Libraries.
You've also worked on a yearbook.
Yes, I edit the Educational Media Yearbook. The idea for it came to me while working on our AV textbook, on our administration of media textbook. Actually, the need for professionals in the field to have in one place a kind of compendium of information that they would use on a daily basis and that would be accurate and up to date. I thought of, why not get out a book on a yearly basis that does this? And one thing led to another, to the point where it has become more than that, but it is essentially a guidebook, a professional guidebook for the field. And I'm now working on the 5th edition of it, and I think it is established as what it was intended to be. I have hopes that more people will buy it than now buy it, but it's enough to keep it going, and I'm hoping that others will get acquainted with it by one hook or crook, and that we'll use more of them.
Now, in addition then to offering a guidebook like this, let me just bring back into focus the fact that you started in teaching, you then did some research, then you were involved in a lot of administration, one way and another, not only administering media programs at school and state level, but also media programs within the military services. And your administration then carried you into being an administrator as Dean of the Graduate School here at San Jose. As you look now into the future of this field, what aspects of it do you think that we should focus more on, the research side, the implementation utilization side, or on the administration side, or should we try and go ahead on all fields? What as you think over the next 5 years or 10 years, what would you recommend to people who are interested in moving ahead in the field? What aspect of it do you think needs the most serious attention?
Well, I think obviously I'd have to say we have to do everything at once. We can't do just one and concentrate on, say, research and ignore the other aspects of the field. I think my advice would be to give, if I were starting out in this field, I would give good attention to who I am and what my real capabilities are, or propensities at least are. And I would look at what in our field now we recognize as the 3 facets of the field, namely product design, media management, or the managerial aspects of our program, and instructional design and development, which incorporates a good emphasis on research. And I would try to say among those 3, which is best for me. And maybe the media management would be the one that most people would choose because it's broader, and it would include some of the other as well. In other words, the generalist type of person would be one who is probably more engaged in media management, but is also interested in instructional design and development, product design and development. I think our professionalism of this field is going to improve when we recognize that we don't all have to be instructional designers, and no one of us is necessarily going to be just an equipment hack. In other words, there's a great range of opportunity in this field, and there are opportunities to specialize in a variety of things. And maybe at the apex right now, we would probably say instructional development or instructional design is that. But I honestly believe that we have a long way to go to get the rest of education to recognize that that is really part of our field. I think without doubt it is. And that we are the only professionals who give it the attention that it really deserves. But there are so many people in our field who are not conversant with that aspect of education and of our field, that even within our field we have a job of trying to recognize who are we. Well, when we can find out that we really are many kinds of people, and that each of us has a contributing specialty to offer, and that he can be a professional in any one of those fields, those specialties, then I think we'll improve the situation.
Jim, it's been a pleasure doing this interview with you, and my only summation of it is that you entered the field with enthusiasm, and from listening to you for the past hour, I'm sure that you'll inspire a lot of enthusiasm regarding the challenges that face us all for students of the field in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.